Hi, my name is Ron Weinberger. I'm the CEO and MD of EMVision. Really excited to be able to take you through our laboratories and to introduce you to some of the key individuals that are associated with the development of what is going to be a transformational product for stroke diagnosis and imaging. Stroke is one of the largest causes of morbidity and mortality in the world today. 15 million people per annum actually have stroke and 5 million people will die from it. It is a $170 billion health economic burden globally, and it causes long-term rehabilitation and community impact. Stroke is extremely time sensitive. There are two types of stroke, a blockage and a bleed. The ischemic stroke or blockage requires a particular type of clinical and therapeutic intervention called TPA, whereas a bleed is managed very differently. So in order to be able to intervene appropriately for the right stroke, for the right patient, at the right time, at the point of care, and the most rapid way possible, you need to be able to determine which type of stroke the patient actually has. The ability of our device is really to be able to very rapidly diagnose at the point of care by the bedside or potentially in the home of the patient. So what we're trying to do is to do what we can to assist the clinicians in making those clinical diagnoses and the ability to actually distinguish between a hemorrhagic and an ischemic stroke in the shortest possible time and as effectively as possible.
Hello, I'm Robert Tiller. I'm Head of Design at EMVision, and EMVision is actually designing 2 generations of our portable brain scanner. Key inputs to designing portable brain scanners. The fundamental thing that we really look for is meeting end user needs. Now, the end user cohort, for example, neurologists, radiologists, ICU doctors and nurses, emergency professionals, paramedics, that entire cohort of people will have a different perspective on what they need, and we need to understand what they need and take that to the product design. We have brilliant relationships with all of those people, but fundamentally, we also need to understand the patient. At a very high level, comfort and safety. Very simple concept. That is the mantra that flows down through the entire product design. So the refinement of all the concepts against all the requirements has culminated into our Gen 1 device, an in-hospital, first commercial in-hospital device, and this product is in fact a springboard to our Gen 2, a portable ambulance deployable product.
Hello everyone, welcome to EMVision's Product Development Lab. I will give you a little bit of information about the behind the scene, and I'll take you through our technology and what we do in the product development team. The eyes, the antenna array, and the brain. As you can see in our first prototype, we had the eyes separated from the brain. One thing that comes to mind is if you look at anatomy of the body, the brains are very close to eyes. Why can't we do that? Because the brain is too big and it doesn't fit in the head of the device. We had a critical partner in our project development, mainly Keysight, and we collaborated with them, and we have designed with their collaboration a customized version of our VNA, i.e. the brain of the device, which fits inside our headset. So the whole headset and the eyes are integrated as one part. So we remove the cable, which means there would be low cost or lower cost. There would be higher reliability because we don't need to worry about EMC and EMI issues, reliability of issues when you are assembling 16 wires into your product. So improvement immediately, tick.
Today, when a patient has a suspected stroke, they require urgent brain imaging. Typically, that means getting to a CT as quickly as possible. And CTs produce excellent images that are used to guide important decision-making, such as surgical intervention or therapeutic treatment. Now, the challenge with CTs is, because of their infrastructure requirements, the ionizing radiation that they emit, and the requirement for specialist operators, they are very large machines that tend to live in the basement of a hospital. So previously, there has been no tool that could be brought to the patient that is widely accessible, that can image the brain at the point of care. And this is critical for time-sensitive emergencies like stroke. With our first gen device, we're aiming to deploy this in hospital environments, ICUs, stroke wards, emergency departments at rural and regional hospitals, and then we're planning to take the core architecture of our Gen 1 helmet and develop a Gen 2 pre-hospital road and air ambulance model. I'm Scott Kirkland, co-founder and executive director of EMVision. I'm responsible for the corporate affairs side of the business, and shortly you'll be seeing our device in a simulated clinical environment, and thereafter you'll be hearing from our scientific and clinical advisory team on the potential clinical use cases of our product and how we can improve patient outcomes. We're entering an exciting period in the history of our company's development as we prepare for multi-site studies that will support the regulatory process to get our product in market, benefiting stroke patients. And we're fortunate to have the support of not just the leading minds in stroke care, but also some of the leading global medical imaging companies.
So my name is Stuart Crozier. For the last 20 years, I've been a professor of biomedical engineering at the University of Queensland and have run the biomedical engineering group. And as part of that group, we have a very strong microwave engineering team that has adapted its focus to biological and medical applications. And most of my background has been in imaging technology and specifically magnetic resonance imaging systems and the engineering of new developments in those systems. And we were fortunate enough to have licensed and patents to GE and Siemens, and that technology is in all of their systems today. And so with those connections, and in MRI, a lot of the basis of MRI is radio frequency engineering, we have been able to patent some applications of microwave engineering that has spun out into EMVision. And I have moved to EMVision to be its Chief Scientific Officer.
So my name is David Cook. I'm an intensive care specialist here in Brisbane. I had completed a PhD about 20 years ago in the department that Stuart's working in at the University of Queensland. For the last 30 years, I've predominantly worked in tertiary referral hospitals in critical care. And prior to that, had worked in the country and had worked with the flying surgeon for a brief period.
So like all good things, this technology didn't happen in a short period of time. It's the culmination of perhaps 15 years of research at the University of Queensland from a systems point of view. So there is novel hardware associated with the device, but novel signal and image processing methods as well. So at the heart of the system, we're looking at the electromagnetic interaction of the electrical properties of tissue within the body. And that's very complex. So some of the waves go through, some are reflected, some are scattered. And making sense of that has taken quite a bit of time. And at the university, a number of novel ways have been patented to do that. And the whole idea of the workflow of the device to make images and classification and localization, we'll talk about later, has been patented and transferred to EMVision. So when we got to the stage where we had it working on phantoms in the laboratory and on healthy humans and had done safety tests and a number of other tests, then EMVision was formed as a spin-off company from the university and now owns all of the IP.
Patient care is a team game. It isn't about the doctor or one nurse. Or what it is, it's a group of people who are physios and therapists and doctors and nurses. And people who work in environmental services, there are a lot of people involved in caring for an individual patient. The opportunities for a device like this, you have to see in the context of the processes of cares that occur on the hundreds or even 1,000 patients who are within a hospital. It's a busy place. It's like an ant farm where people are doing stuff and coordinating the care of patients. A small device which can be moved to the bedside and can fit in with the cares of the patient during the course of the day, that's safe and mobile and reproducible and doesn't have ionising radiation that's a danger to anybody, then we have a device that we can integrate into patient care on a daily basis without having to take the patient off the floor. And removing a patient is an hour. It's an hour out of the day that you can't do other things to look after that patient because they're travelling down to a radiology suite. It may be even 2 hours, but it's a big chunk of the day. So we would see that this is a device that could come to the bedside and would be able to take images which would allow guiding ongoing care, so you could see how your treatments are working beyond just observing how the patient's responded. There's a potential for doing multiple scans during the course of a patient's stay without overly disrupting the patient care that they're providing. And for really sick patients, the speed at which we can do the scans is very advantageous. And patients for whom even the movement from a critical care area to another room can be dangerous and is a highly coordinated and highly labour-intensive piece of work. The possibility of being able to do the scans in the patient's bed would not only be quicker, but potentially a lot safer than moving them around the hospital. That's not to say we have problems, but there's a lot of work goes into logistics of moving sick people around, which we might be able to avoid. We now know it's proven that early treatment works. A lot of stuff, it works in medicine, in particular in the diagnosis and treatment of stroke. So where would an ideal imaging device sit? What would it look like? Well, it would be small, and it wouldn't be as expensive as a full-blown CT scanner. It would ideally fit in its own ambulance rather than having a dedicated ambulance to carry it, which is the CT scanner. It would not have ionising radiation, which would it would be safe to use. It would be really fast, and it would be reliable in terms of the results that it gives us in terms of diagnosis. So I think that the opportunity for technologies like this that we're talking about in radio frequency imaging, microwave imaging, is it ticks most of those boxes. There is some work to do. You know, it is a small device. It runs on low energy. It doesn't create ionising radiation like CTs. It is substantially smaller and cheaper than both CTs and MRs. It wouldn't require its own vehicle to drive it around. It would fit potentially in the back of a modified standard, but modified ambulance. So that's kind of the opportunity that we saw. And as Stuart was talking about the translation aspect of the research that we're talking about, is translation research has really got to have an implementable landing point. So a lot of good ideas in the lab. There's a lot of good ideas that are in the literature, but we have to be able to see how that translates into an implementable solution, which is useful and has value to the community. And that's how I would see the opportunity for devices that we're describing and what we're looking at here, is they tick all the boxes potentially, and there's work to do. You know, that if it was easy and if people had already done it, then it'd already be done. But there is work to do. But that's where the opportunity is. A small, mobile, safe, reproducible, you can have 100 of them rather than one. That's the opportunity. Well, firstly, these aren't questions that would normally appear in clinical textbooks. These are questions and issues that are important in the way we use the information that our devices will provide us. In this particular case, the classification means the ability to know with reliability, with great reliability, whether the stroke is hemorrhagic due to blood leaking out of a blood vessel, or ischemic, which is due to a blockage of a blood vessel. Localisation of the stroke is important for us as clinicians because it provides us with a correlation between the symptoms and the functional injury that the patient has, or the clinical effects of their stroke, and the position it is, and to make sure that everything correlates. And that, with the size of it, also allows the clinicians, the neurologists, emergency physicians, to make informed choices on the risk and the benefit of the treatments that we can offer, and to make sure that we know where the stroke is, we know the type of the stroke and the size of the stroke. That, plus with the clinical correlates, will inform the way that we make the decisions about treatment. The dielectric map is slightly different. The dielectric map is a representation of physical properties of the tissues, a map, which allows us to see a version of the anatomy of the brain. So we'd be familiar with looking at pictures from CTs and MRs that use other physical properties and interactions with signals and radiation to allow us to draw a map of the brain. And a dielectric map has the same sort of idea, where we use the physical properties of brain tissue, the dielectric properties, the permittivity and conductivity, which vary between tissue types, to be able to map out what the brain looks like in the areas of our imaging. So it displays the anatomy. And it would be useful in the first instance to be able to localise where our scanning field is. And that's important because we would be able to look at the anatomical structures. And I think in the future, because it's in the future, once we have a lot more information about the way that the dielectric of the permittivity and the conductivity changes, so even the normal values for human tissues over a large number of people in a population, and the way that those change in disease and change over time with disease, it has the potential to be a diagnostic tool. So pulsatility uses the changes that occur in phase with the heartbeat as the blood courses through tissues. And the changes in the dielectric properties occur at the same timing as the blood flows with the heartbeats and the pulse of the blood. So what that means is that it offers a window into seeing where blood is flowing through tissues and where blood is not. There would be a pulsatile or pulsatility signal where the blood is flowing, and it will be minimal or lacking where there is very low or absent blood flow. In the setting of stroke, what that means is it may be possible to identify those areas of the brain that are no longer being perfused with blood because of an occluded blood vessel. And the really attractive thing is we don't have to inject contrast medium, because at the moment, to do this sort of thing with CT, using a different perfusion scan, it requires injection of a contrast medium. Pulsatility simply looks at the phasic changes that occur in the tissues with the heartbeat. There was, even at the beginning of thinking of how we might use microwave technology, any tissue that has penetration, reflection and scatter with microwaves will potentially set up a analyzable signal at the antenna. So the glib answer is anything, but when I talk about translation, it's got to be worthwhile. And so one of the reasons that from an early point we didn't push a trivial application is that it wouldn't have value, because it would work, but it wouldn't have value. Whereas something like stroke or the other possible applications that become not just what's possible, but what has great value in translation, things to do with hearts, and would have a huge value. Looking at lungs, looking at lung pathology would have a huge value. looking at dynamic movements of things like joints and soft tissues after injuries, looking at things like specific things like concussion. These are things that have enormous value, and the journey for translation is worth taking.
Yeah, just to add to that, we have projects going on looking at the applications for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, for example. So that's an area where there are some potential solutions, but often biopsies are needed. So this is potentially, again, a low-cost, lightweight solution similar to a belt that the patient would wrap around the lower thorax, around the liver region, and get a spectroscopic sort of answer that could lead to a number, that being the fat content of the liver, which is very useful in some circumstances. And similarly, as David said, number of lung conditions. But we've also had interest from quite a few clinicians about other neurological conditions. Traumatic brain injury, brain swelling is very difficult to measure without doing invasive tests for patients. So potentially our device could do things like give the clinicians information about brain swelling without intervention. And other neurodegenerative diseases perhaps in the future. So there are a lot of applications in neurology and in other parts of the body, as David said, but our main concerted focus at the moment is on for stroke patients. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I think clearly the clinicians have to trust the device. And the way that happens is we have to do clinical trials. The results of those clinical trials submitted to regulatory authorities, but also published. And we have to have sites around the world where these tests, clinical tests, are done and lead to early adopters of the technology. So it needs some clinical champions to see the results from the technology, to see its application, and to see that it can benefit their workflow and the patient outcomes. And the steps along the way are to do the clinical trials, to publish those results, to submit them to regulatory authorities, to gain that clinical acceptance. And I was around when MRI was first being commercialized in the late 80s. And there was considerable discussion about its place in the radiology landscape, where CTs were very well established at that stage. And there were some reluctance in some quarters to adopt MRI. And similarly, we don't see EMVision's technology as displacing other technologies. We see it as adding value in the clinical workplace. And that's why we're specifically targeting those applications that the clinicians have told us add value to them and to the patient outcomes.